Welcome back, Marcus. In a minute.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Colton Ogburn, and these are all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in Severance Season 2, Episode 1. So we're going to break down all of the hidden clues in this episode about what Lumen is really up to. We're also going to take a look at the final shot of the episode featuring Miss Casey on the testing floor. We're going to talk about who the hell this guy lurking in the hallway is. We'll explain Cold Harbor and how it connects to the Civil War and the origins of Lumen. And we will get into our theory that Heliar has yet to return and that this is 100% her outie, Helena Egan, daughter of the Lumen CEO, pretending to be her innie, Helly. And guys, by the way, we have this great Praise Kier sticky note shirt up on the merch store right now, ScreenCrushMerch.com. Get yours now. So it has been a long 3 years since the season 1 finale, and I have been eagerly awaiting its return. In fact, one of the first ScreenCrush videos I ever watched was Ryan's ending explained for the first season, and that's actually what turned me on to this show. This series is a modern day masterclass in how to make television in the streaming age, and a reminder on how truly great television can be when storytelling is given the proper time and attention that it deserves. Severance is essentially a workplace dark comedy with a science fiction bent, and it's really a brilliant commentary on the employee-employer relationship in our modern era. So, season 1 ended with Mark, Helly, Dylan, and Irving bucking the system and finally standing up against their oppressors. Dylan sneaks into the security office and activates the overtime contingency, allowing for Mark, Helly, and Irving to wake up on the outside. Irving went to find his beloved Bert. Helly wakes up at the Lumen Gala, realizing that her outie is bad news and an Egan, and Mark wakes up at his brother-in-law Rickon's reading party for his book, The UUR. Remember, Mark and the others have become fans of Rickon on the inside after finding and reading his book in the office. Now, at this party, Mark S. learns that his outie underwent the severance procedure following the death of his wife. But Mark S., the innie, recognizes his outie's late wife as health and wellness counselor Miss Casey. So season 2 opens with audio from the season 1 finale.
They torture us down there! We're prisoners!
We hear Helly telling the crowd at the Lumen Gala that they are not happy down on the severed floor. We can hear Irving screaming Bert's name and banging on his front door. And of course, Mark yelling, "She's alive!" So when Mark arrives back on the severed floor, he is awaking for the first time since being on the outside. According to Mr. Milchek, it's been 5 months since the MDR uprising. And guys, the filmmaker in me has to give this show serious props for its super creative cinematography. I love the push zoom technique that they do to create the focal length change, demonstrating the transition between innies and outies. And this continuous shot of Mark Tom cruising through the halls is yet another great example of the top-notch cinematography and attention to detail that they have on this show. So as Mark runs through the halls, we see him pass this purple themed room that we actually saw here in season 1. And a little later we hear that the new refiner's old MDR office was also purple.
But I love the green carpet. Ours was a creme brulee and the keyboards were puce.
They were purple.
So Mark makes his way to the Health and Wellness Center to find Miss Casey. When entering the waiting room to the Health and Wellness Center, we can see that the doors to her office have been completely removed. And if you look here behind Mark, we can see an outline on the wall where this painting from season 1 used to hang. The painting that we saw Irving and Bert admiring the first time they met in this scene. Now that's not the only thing behind Mark. We also have this guy lurking in the background, but we're going to talk about that here in a sec. So when Mark arrives in the MDR office, we can see this trinket on one of the desks, likely a perk won by this employee for his previous refining work in another MDR. Milchek then arrives wearing a blue turtleneck and carrying these blue balloons with Mark's face on them. Here in a sec, I want to tell you just how disturbing the symbolism behind these balloons is, but first let's talk about the significance of the color blue in this series and this episode specifically, and how it connects to the war between the severed employees and their oppressors like Miss Cobell, Mr. Milchek, and Helena Egan. Essentially, the color blue down on the severed floor is representing calm, while simultaneously being connected to control. The color blue can be comforting, and that's what they're trying to do, make the innies feel calm, comfortable, and at peace so that they may do their work. But the color blue is also associated with the higher-ups like Miss Cobell, and now with Mr. Milchek, and even on Helly R, who on the outside is of course Helena Egan. The color blue is also seen all over the severed floor, such as the computers, and even being the primary color we see many of the severed employees wearing, again representing calm and control. So next we meet Miss Wong, who is disturbingly a child. Miss Wong's position is that of deputy manager, and this is her first day in this new role. Prior to that, she was a crossing guard. So my first question was,
Why are you a child?
but I also found myself wondering, where the hell were you a crossing guard? I mean, what is going on in the depths of Lumen that called for a crossing guard? But like I said, the more disturbing question is, why is there a child working at Lumen on the severed floor? A child should be at school during the day, not working a job. I also don't think that she's unsevered like Milchek and gets to go home every day. I think, like Miss Casey and like employees that Petey mentioned in season 1, she never leaves.
I found a department, one they don't tell us about, one where you don't get to leave.
The only scenario in which I can imagine a child working at Lumen, and that actually being allowed, would only be in a situation like with Miss Casey, where, up in the outer world, Miss Wong is dead. So here in a bit, I want to share our theory on what the hell is going on at Lumen and how it all connects to a quest for immortality and the resurrection of Kier. And I think Miss Wong, Miss Casey, and even this dude lurking in the hallway behind Mark will give us our answer. But first, let's take a look at a few more details from this episode that contribute to our working theory. In Milchek's office, we see this newspaper called the Kier Chronicle. At the top of the paper, it says published since 1893. That's 28 years after the founding of Lumen. Keep that in mind, it's going to come back into play here in a sec. In this corner here, it reads your trusted source for goings-on in Kier and the greater world. Remember that our Audis do live in the town of Kier. So it's also here on the paper that we can see this Photoshop picture featuring the team photo from season 1, placing the team into an old school convertible at what looks like a parade. Under the picture, it reads, here, Lumen employees were celebrated on Sunday for exposing the nature of severed work. Now, Milchek presents this paper as if it's in circulation on the surface, and they even went through the trouble of redacting a lot of the text on the page with a Sharpie. But I actually think we're meant to take this as yet another manipulation trying to trick the innies into thinking that their outies are being celebrated on the outside for their innies work, contributing to the theme of innies being told they're happy on the outside and that an innie's role is to serve their outer self. So it's clear that Lumen is doing your classic apology tour that we see corporations in our real world do when they're busted doing bad stuff. They're putting on this facade to the outer world and to the innies below that they have learned from their mistakes and that they are grateful for the opportunity to become a better company, when in reality it's all just damage control. It's PR bullshit. Okay, so now let's talk about these balloons. I love the imagery of having Mark's head on a balloon. One, it's a mirroring of the visual focal length change we see in the elevator when Mark switches between his innie and his outie. This visualization makes the head look like it's actually being inflated with air like a balloon. The same thing would happen with the image of Mark's face on the balloons. As air is added or removed, the picture would stretch. I also really love this shot in the hall when Mark releases the balloons and we see them float to the ceiling, but they are blocked by the ceiling from ascending any higher. Just like the consciousness of an innie is unable to ascend beyond the severed floor. That is, of course, without enabling the overtime protocol. Now, this shot of the balloons is brilliantly symbolizing how Mark is desperate to leave this place and crawl his way out of the severed floor. Next, we have the pass the ball game. Here we see a red ball passed around as a team building exercise. Now, this red ball could be in reference to the popular red ball theory as well as the ball in the box analogy. Both of those essentially use a red ball to demonstrate emotions like grief or anxiety, both of which Mark S. is suffering from. Red also, of course, symbolizes emotions such as rage, but also love. Mark, Helly, Irving, and Dylan are all experiencing great rage, but rage that is triggered by separation from something they love. Mark has the knowledge that his wife from the outie world is thought to be dead, but is actually alive and being held captive by Lumen. Helly wants freedom and now knows that her outie is an Egan. Dylan wants to know his family, and Irving wants to be with Bert. All of them have love in their hearts that is being stomped out by Lumen, causing rage. Now next we hear mention of the Perpetuity Wing.
What's your perpetuity wing like?
You'll remember in season 1 that we saw the team travel to the Perpetuity Wing, which was of course suggested by Irving to help Helly find her meaning at Lumen. There we saw these wax figures of all the Lumen CEOs, but we learned that in these new workers' former Perpetuity Wing, they say that their Eagons were animatronic, meaning that they could move, and they conclude that this must mean that Mark's wing has wax figures instead of animatronics because their wing is older. Now here we also hear Dario say that in his former workplace, instead of an elevator, they had a rope? Now, in Mark's funny note about Milchek, we hear mention of the 9 core principles.
A man whose stupidity is rivaled only by that of the 9 core principles.
The 9 core principles are vision, verve, wit, cheer, humility, benevolence, nimbleness, probity, and wiles. These principles are of course part of Lumen's cult-like manipulation of their employees, which is symbolic of corporate rule. But it is also a commentary on organized religion, echoing the 7 virtues of Catholicism, and these two even share the rule of humility. I also think that these 9 principles could also be in connection to Dante's Inferno and the 9 circles of hell, and I'm going to dive deep into all of that here shortly. So next we find out that despite Mark having woken up to the realities of Lumen, and we see that Mark has become a true rebel, however, he is still very naive. I say this because we see him plead to the board.
I know that you want to do the right thing for severed people, which is why I need to see my team again.
You'd think by this point Mark would know that the board is likely even worse than the likes of Milchek and Cobell.
Is the board even there?
Yes.
Okay, so after Mark S shows that he will not comply and he will not be a reliable employee until he sees his team again, we see the return of Irving, Helly, and Dylan. But before they return, we get this creepy ass painting called Kier Pardons His Betrayers. In this painting, we see Kier in what looks like a Union uniform from the American Civil War. And this is actually connected to Cold Harbor, the project that Macrodata Refinement is working on with the scary numbers. Behind Kier in this painting, we can see an army of men carrying rifles that have bayonets attached. And Kier is pardoning 4 people who are buried shoulder deep. These 4 heads sticking out of the ground symbolize the innies having poked their heads up beyond the surface of the underground severed floor, tying into the theme of Mark's head on the balloon trying to poke his head out into the above world. Now, being buried neck deep in the ground also symbolizes the stressful emotions and feeling of being trapped one can feel when overwhelmed, especially regarding their job, which of course this entire series is essentially an allegory for. Work-life balance, feeling trapped in a career, and barely being able to keep your head above water. Now, you'll also notice that on Kier's sword, there's blood on the blade. So Dylan is the first to return, and he immediately talks about how Milchek had tackled him, referring to this scene in the season 1 finale.
Just open the door and I'll tell you their names. Come on, Dylan.
But something actually stuck out to me here. The last thing Dylan remembered wouldn't be being tackled by Milchek. Dylan was still on the severed floor when the overtime levers switched back, meaning that Dylan's innie was still present following his tackling. So I'm anxious to know what happened after Milchek tackled him to the ground. It sounds to me like Dylan wasn't at Lumen much longer following his takedown. Now, when Irving arrives, we hear him banging on the elevator doors, screaming Bert. This is because the last time we saw him, he was at Bert's house banging on the door, screaming his name. And then there's the return of Helly R, or should I say, Helena. That's right, I don't think for a second that this is actually Helly R. I think this is Helena and that she is in full control and acting as if she is Helly R. We actually got a hint at this being the case later in the episode when she lies about what she saw when she woke up on the outside.
Saw the inside of a really boring apartment.
Now, at first I thought that Helly must just be ashamed of the fact that she's an Egan, and maybe she even feared what her friend's response would be to learning who her outie really is. But Helly just doesn't strike me as the type to hide this type of revelation, and Helena doesn't strike me as the type that would allow Helly R to return. And that's why I think that Helly is really Helena undercover. I think that Helena has seen to it that her severed inhibitor be shut off or disabled. It's still in her head, but just not currently active. And of course we know that they have the ability to switch these inhibitors between consciousnesses regardless of being on the severed floor or not. So anyway, we see that the break room has been reformed. No longer is it home to the disturbing apology board.
I really am sorry, okay?
Now it's a literal break room where instead of being broken down, you can actually take a break and recuperate, or so they say. This room, along with its corporate posters and condescending cartoon praising the MDR team for their uprising, it's all reminiscent of when a company like in the real world gets busted doing something super shady, and then they come out with their little apology pretending like they give a damn about actually doing better.
We are deeply sorry. We're sorry. We're sorry.
In this video, we hear recorded audio from season 1, such as Bert saying,
Let's burn this place to the ground.
This of course reminds us that they're always being watched and listened to. Now, Milchek does say,
Privacy shouldn't mean packing into a supply closet like so many sardines.
that is in reference to this scene, of course, from season 1.
If they can wake us up on the outside, what's to stop us from doing it to ourselves?
Next, we get another clue that Helly is actually Helena when she says,
He said there were no microphones in here.
Helly R wouldn't have believed a word out of Milchek's mouth, so it's clear to me that she is actually Helena and she is trying to pull information out of Mark, Irving, and Dylan and learn what they did on the surface. Now, while I'm pretty confident that this is Helena, there are certain moments that make me wonder if it could actually be Helly, such as her telling Irvin that it's okay to tell them what he saw up there, even if it was bad. This moment and that look on her face implies that Helly is referring to her own hidden and shameful discovery. But I think we might actually be seeing Helena feeling a little guilty for her role in all of this, and that she is just being manipulative and trying to find out what they saw up there. There's also this scene.
We're not the same, actually. Us and the Audis were not.
But I still think that this is actually Helena having a disdain for her innie, Helly. And that's why it seems so genuine, because she is trying to convince herself that what she's doing is right and that what they're doing to the innies is not immoral. But I think deep down, she knows that it is. Okay, so next we see Miss Wong playing with a toy where you try to get these little rings around the hands of a swimming Kier. The rings are red, blue, and green, like the red, blue, and green lights on this projector in the break room and the red, blue, and green paper in the supply closet. Now, her playing this game is likely meant to remind us that despite her acting like an adult, Miss Wong is still a child. Irving goes on to tell Dylan that the paintings of a black hallway with a red down pointing arrow, the same elevator that we saw Miss Casey taken to in the season 1 finale. Remember, Irving's Audi is the one painting all of these pictures of that same elevator. And in season 1, we also saw Irving having trouble staying awake at work and he would see the black ooze coming onto his desk. This all implies that Irving has been down to the testing floor before, but he doesn't remember it. Okay, so let's finally get into the cold harbor of it all. So at the end of the episode, we see Mark working on his scary numbers, and at the top of the screen, it reads Cold Harbor. So I did some Googling, and Cold Harbor is a battle from the American Civil War that took place in 1864, 1 year before the founding of Lumen. Now, the Battle of Cold Harbor was one where the Union got draxed by the Confederacy. In Richmond, Virginia, in the spring of 1864, Confederate General Robert E. Lee outmaneuvered Union General Ulysses S. Grant, and he won the battle. Remember, earlier in the episode, we saw Kier in what appeared to be a Union uniform. Now, we know, of course, that the Union would go on to win the war, in our reality, that is. But I'm beginning to wonder if in this reality that Severance takes place in, did the war go a different way? I mean, the Civil War was a battle of the states, and in Severance, our Audis live in a state abbreviated PE, which isn't a real state. So I think it's possible that they could be living in an alternate timeline with an alternate history. I mean, the Civil War was about slavery, and this series is also essentially about slavery. Not race-based slavery, but class-based slavery. Not only how those in poverty have become essentially slave labor working at starvation wages, but also how the middle class is given just enough comfortability to keep them working hard and generating wealth for the top. It's also worth mentioning that Mark Scout was once a professor, a history professor to be exact. A history professor whose expertise was World War I, which took place about 50 years after the American Civil War.
No one would have called it World War I because World War II hadn't happened yet.
Mark's knowledge of history and war is likely why he was sought out for this position. Now, it's also on this screen that we can see a flash to another screen that also reads Cold Harbor and features Miss Casey. These graphics on the screen are similar to the graphics on the bottom of Mark's screen, confirming that what Mark is working on is connected to the testing that's happening on the floor below, and likely connected directly to Miss Casey. And here we can see what looks like moving cells, specifically brain cells. I think think it's clear that with all of this praise Kier nonsense, this is some kind of elite cult who is trying to perfect immortality, because there's one thing that no amount of money can change. There's one thing that you and I have in common with a billionaire like Elon Musk, and that is the fact that we are all going to die. No amount of money can result in cheating death. And I think that this rich oligarch Kier was unwilling to accept this fate, and he spent his life trying to achieve immortality, and we're seeing that mission continue over the decades at Lumen. And their mission, I believe, is to resurrect Kier Egan and achieve immortality for themselves. Now, Lumen could be trying to perfect cloning, but not just cloning. I think they're trying to perfect the transfer of consciousness, and that's where the severed chip and the study of consciousness and what it means to be you comes into play. Remember, Ricken's book is called The You Are. Now, sure, assuming that you master cloning technology, you could clone yourself before you die, but that's still really not you. It's a copy of you. Your personal consciousness still would cease to exist when you die in your body. But if one could figure out how to transfer consciousness instead of merely duplicating it, you could theoretically master immortality. Now, in our real world, consciousness is still something that modern science doesn't quite have a grasp on. So I think that in this show, that is what Lumen is doing. They are trying to crack the code on consciousness, what it is, and how to access it as a tangible thing that could theoretically be eternal once it is understood. This series is all about what it means to be you. It's a philosophical analysis of consciousness. We see the severed employees as a completely clean slate consciousness that Lumen controls, and they're tested by literally picking numbers that they find scary amongst literal lines of scrolling code. I believe that they are trying to give tangibility to consciousness, and they hope to be able to treat consciousness like a software. My theory is that they are trying to figure out how to translate the electrical synapses in the brain that create consciousness and translate it, not copy it, but transfer it like software onto new hardware. It's been theorized before that Miss Casey isn't actually Mark's wife, but a clone of Mark's wife, and that could explain why she, unlike the others, has such an odd personality that's almost otherworldly. Now, when talking to my friends Harriet and Lee, who are video editors here at ScreenCrush and fellow Severance fans, they both had some awesome theories on who this man lurking in the background could be, and they are both tied to this cloning and consciousness theory. One possibility is that it is Grainer. Grainer had a security, he died in season 1, but what if this guy lurking in the halls is a new Grainer, Grainer's clone, doing his job and monitoring the severed halls? The other fun theory is that we're having a bit of a Loki season 2 moment here, and that the guy sneaking up behind Mark and watching from the hall is actually Mark. And later this season, we could see the perspective of this other Mark watching his other self in that health and wellness center. If Lumen is trying to master immortality, they'd need both cloning tech to create the bodies, but also the consciousness tech that we have discussed. What if their search for the scary numbers is them essentially creating a tangible code of their consciousness? Now, while in the real world, we have not cracked the code on consciousness, we have, however, kind of figured out cloning. We've actually cloned a lamb, and I think that the goats that we saw in season 1 of Severance are test subjects for Lumen's cloning tech. Now, goats, of course, also have a connection to Satanism, and I am rather certain that the severed floor and the testing floor are meant to represent hell, but not just hell, the 9 circles of hell, Dante's Inferno. And the 9 circles of hell could be being mirrored by the 9 rules of Lumen, which could also represent the 9 levels of Lumen going deeper and deeper into the ground. That's right, I think the severed floor and the testing floor are just the 2nd and 3rd levels to an even deeper evil, that evil being Kier. In Dante's Inferno, we know that the devil, the beast himself, he is on the bottom floor. So perhaps that's where we could find the body of Kier Egan. Now, I know that was a lot, but that's what I think is going down, and I wanted to put it out there before seeing the rest of the season. And I cannot wait to watch these upcoming episodes with you guys and break them down each week. But guys, those were just my thoughts on the first episode of Severance Season 2. I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments below, or you can at me on Twitter, or find me in our Discord, link in the description below. And remember to check out our Praise Kier sticky note shirt up on our merch store right now. And if you're new here, please do feel free to subscribe and smash that bell for alerts so you don't miss a thing. For ScreenCrush, I'm Colton Ogburn.